Gerald Steinberg, professor of political science from Bar-Ilan University and founder and president of NGO Monitor, an advocacy group that tracks the work of non-governmental organizations critical of Israel. So, Professor Steinberg, let's start with the Jordanian border and what happened yesterday with the Prime Minister. He says that Israel has to put fences up to protect us from the wild beasts. Is that in the best interest of Israel's national security?
We're in a very strange, unusual, I would say unique regional situation, in the sense that across the borders, what we see in Syria, what we see in Egypt, what we see in Iraq, and it changes periodically. There's a lot of violence. Sinai is now largely occupied. Maybe that's not the right term, but there are Al-Qaeda forces in there, and they're using Sinai to attack, trying to get through. Jordan is also part of that. So what I see from the Prime Minister and from the Chief of Staff of the IDF and others is a policy, a general policy. Not only they went to see, and it was very photogenic to be filmed along the quietest border, along with Jordan, but as the Prime Minister said, we need to protect ourselves. We need to realize that across of every border, we have problems with the regimes and their inability, even if they wanted to maintain those borders to be stable, not to have infiltrations. It certainly can't happen in Egypt, and we worry about what happens across in Jordan as well. So that's the general policy, to seal all of Israel's borders with physical barriers, with fences.
It's a bit of a ghetto mentality. I mean, why Jordan? We have excellent relations with the military of Jordan. Why do you think we need a barrier there?
I think in general, specifically in this era, everybody needs to have the ability to control immigration, and not just immigration, but prevent terrorists from coming in. Yes, the relations with the Jordanian, not only the royal family and the government, but also with the military are extremely close and coordinated. But that doesn't mean that there are not going to be incidents that take place where you could have the infiltration, and that's happened before across the Jordan border. Everybody makes mistakes, and so in order to be able to have that extra bit of insurance, let's have all those borders protected.
Let's move on to the European Union. Professor, what do you make of these reports that Israel and the European Union are trying to reconcile their differences?
I think it makes sense. It certainly rings true with what I see when I go to Brussels, when I talk to Israeli officials. You talked about in your news summary, and you showed images of the fact that the fight was very sharp over the issue of product labeling.
Right.
And that took place a number of months ago, where Israel felt very much like it was a victim of a surprise attack in some ways. That's part of a political war. It's related to the boycott movement, BDS, and Israel felt very much that there were forces within the European Union driving this process, one-sided, only Israel. Other countries, other areas where there are occupied territories like Cyprus or the Western Sahara, other places where there are conflicts, there the European Union doesn't have a product labeling policy. It's not, and it's more than that. It's the constant attacks against Israel, which are seen as one-sided, ill-informed, and the area that I focus a lot on, all of this European money, government money that's being used to influence Israeli politics and to promote the image of Israel as guilty of war crimes around the world, all these NGOs. So these are all on the agenda. So what Israel did, the Netanyahu government, the foreign ministry, said, we're going to suspend our cooperation with Europe on the peace process.
They played hardball with the Europeans.
Somewhat hardball.
Yeah.
A little bit increase the Israeli assertion of rights and of having been
But it seems to have worked. I mean, they want to talk now. But let me ask you a question about the BDS. And how did the European labeling of the products from Judea and Samaria affect the BDS movement?
It's BDS light. We're going to start, and I'm very clear about that, the NGOs that are driving this process. You've got a group called the European Council on Foreign Relations, which is really an NGO. And you've got groups like Who Profits. You've got lots of groups out there in Europe that are promoting this BDS process. Let's start with product labeling in the West Bank. And the next move, and they say it very clearly, and they wanted to do this already this month. It was slowed down. What else is going on in the West Bank? Israeli banks. Every Israeli bank gives mortgages. They have branches in Ma'ale Adumim, they have them in Katzrin, not just the West Bank, but in what they call occupied territory, also within East Jerusalem. All those pieces are together. So first you start with product labeling, and then what they call differentiation, which is a fancy word for not such light BDS. We're going to differentiate between what goes on within the pre-67, 1949 armistice lines and everything else. And that, since there's no distinction, if you have a boycott on Bank Poalim or Bank Beinlaumi Arishon or any of the other banks that are there, these are national banks, and that's clearly designed to shut down or to do real damage to the entire Israeli economy.
let me ask you something. You mentioned about European funding to the NGOs here in Israel, and NGO Monitor is the one that's monitoring all this funding. How is it impacting, and where is it impacting?
The funding or the monitoring? Or
No,
both,
not
maybe?
the monitoring, the funding from Europe.
There are a number of different areas. We just talked about the BDS movement, and those NGOs are leading the push for different forms of sanctions and product labeling and boycotts. We see it among church divestment groups now. Recently in the United States, the Methodists joined the Presbyterians. We see it on college campuses, the image of Israel as a country of war criminals. That's all we see and hear in many of the campuses. Those are all led by European-funded NGOs. Some Israeli, like Breaking the Silence and B'Tselem, some Palestinians, like Al-Haq and Al-Mazan, and some are international European, based in Europe, like Amnesty and the French version of Amnesty, which is FIDH. So that campaign has done a lot of damage to Israel.
What do you make of this controversial transparency bill that's being passed by the Knesset?
Well, first of all, it's in the process, and I think we have a few months to come up with a better alternative, and I think there is a better alternative. I think that one doesn't have to have what are limitations through legislation in every situation, but rather I have proposed, and we've seen some movement towards this, negotiated guidelines between, let's say, members of the Israeli Knesset. It can be government to government, but I think perhaps it would work better where you have a group of members of the Knesset from different parties, so they represent a broad Israeli consensus, negotiating guidelines with the European counterparts. No anti-Semitism. We, the European Union, will prevent giving funding to groups that are engaged in any form of anti-Semitism. Believe it or not, they don't have such a guideline, and some of the money that goes to groups under the heading of promoting peace or democracy get involved in some very nasty anti-Semitic activities.
But what do you say to those?
This was one of many criteria.
Well, what do you say to those who say that this is discriminatory against left-wing groups against Israel?
First of all, they have a point in the sense that it's also discriminatory because no European government gives any money to any NGO other than left-wing groups. And in fact, there have been some applications and attempts, and maybe now the Europeans are beginning to give to women's groups that are not involved in politics and forcing an end to the occupation and their language and other things. That's been a real hole in it. There is a lot of private money going both to the left and to the right. That also needs to be monitored, but it's different than government money. Okay. So this debate that we're having in Israel on European government money should not be the end of the debate, but rather the beginning, where there should also be some greater discussion about the impact of all this money that's coming in for political groups, for left and for right, for ultra-Orthodox and ultra-secular. We are very permeated as a society, I think more than any other democracy, by foreign funding coming into playing in our political field. And that's something that needs to be looked at in some more detail.
Well, Professor Gerald Steinberg of NGO Monitor and Bar-Ilan University, thanks so much for joining IBA.
Thank you, Ari.